Hola y bienvenidos. Welcome to Table Talk. Whether you're here with us on Zoom, Facebook Live, or Clubhouse, my name is Andy Engel. I'm Senior Programmer at Reimagine. For anyone who needs a visual description, I'm a white cisgender male, grayish hair, tropical shirt, orange background, and there is a banner behind me with the Reimagine logo. Kind of looks like an open door or an open window. Thank you for joining the second of 3 table talks by and for LGBTQ+ communities. Tonight is De Ambiente, grief, faith, and the LGBTQ+ Boricua diaspora. Last week's table talk focused on housing and healthy aging. And you can find that recording on the Table Talk webpage, which is letsreimagine.org/tabletalk, or on Reimagine's Vimeo library. Let's make sure first that we're clear on a few terms. De ambiente. Literally, it means atmosphere or environment, but it's also a coded reference among LGBTQ folks of Latin American descent. It's a wink and a nod that you're in a space of connection and resistance. And that is true for tonight as well. Boricua, it means a person of Puerto Rican descent. That name is a great source of ethnic pride. It derives from Boriquen, the indigenous name for the island prior to its colonization. Table Talk was born last summer as part of Reimagine's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative. That's JEDI for short. It's a series of honest, lively, and unscripted conversations by and for underrepresented communities. At the same time, everyone is invited to these spaces to witness, listen, and learn. Here's the central question that grounds Table Talk. What does it mean to live and die well, specifically among groups that have been historically marginalized, who experience disproportionate obstacles to healthy living and dignified dying? Our vision for Table Talk is that it becomes a regular booster shot of knowledge, empathy, cultural humility, and community. So far, we've had some powerful table talks led by Black communities and by Asian American folks. Yes, tonight's event is part of the LGBTQ+ series, but what I love about this particular talk is that it complicates all of these neatly categorized and distinct communities. This table talk straddles LGBTQ+ and Latinx, 2 extremely vast groupings of people. And to complicate matters further, so many Boricuas share African, European, and indigenous ancestry. You may have heard the song at the beginning. It's bomba, a style of Puerto Rican music that originates from Black slaves who worked the sugarcane fields. It's rebellious music. The joy in working on this LGBTQ+ series, a warm and yummy alphabet soup, is to witness all the intersecting identities that feed into queer lives. I want to thank our 2021 sponsors. We cannot do this work without your support. And I especially want to highlight the John and Wauna Harmon Foundation for their support of Reimagine's JEDI initiative, which makes Table Talk possible. And I also want to thank the primary co-host of this series, SAGE, an organization that collaborated with Reimagine on its in-person festival back in 2018. They serve LGBTQ+ older adults across the US and Puerto Rico. And also shout outs to BAD in the Bronx and Del Ambiente in Orlando for help with promotion. If any of you in the live audience have to drop off at any time, please know that we will be sending out the recording in an email to all those who have registered. I also want to thank Rosa Colon Guerra, an artist who is on this call. Rosa, do you want to just wave hello to us? Thank you. Hi, Rosa. She will be drawing some comics based on this conversation. Her camera won't be on, but we hope to be sharing these comics in the future. And a special thank you to Reimagine's all-queer production team on tonight's Table Talk, Zubin Desai and Misha Palmer. Another thing I want to mention is language. Tonight's program is not simultaneously interpreted in Spanish. We are taking small, sweet steps with Table Talk and that means developing a thoughtful plan and the raising of necessary funds for this type of access going forward. We are planning to have Spanish interpretation at our Latinx Community Forum in July, so please join us for that. I am now going to launch a poll. Quick question for all of you. Hope you can all see this. Do you feel comfortable or confident having conversations with loved ones about what it means to live and die well? Thank you. Keep going. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. So before I introduce you to our guests, I want to tell you about our guests. They are an excellent representation of the Boricua diaspora. They are dispersed all over Chicago, Orlando, DC, and the island, and they've all lived in other places. Each has a personal story of grief and trauma to share, and all of them, as either mental health professionals or spiritual leaders, have provided support and resources to those grieving. Nancy Rosado was at ground zero during 2 of the deadliest terrorist attacks that took place on US soil. First, when she was at the World Trade Center as an NYPD sergeant on 9/11. Second, when she was in Orlando in 2016, the year of the Pulse nightclub massacre. And then a year later, when she was supporting refugees from Puerto Rico who relocated to Florida after Hurricane Maria. You should check out her collection of oral histories of those survivors in Tossed to the Wind. You can find full bios of Nancy, Wilfred Labiosa, Lisbeth Melendez Rivera, and Reverend R.J. Robles. They're in that listing that you used to register for this event. I consider all of them my coaches and teachers. Nancy, I'm so grateful that you're kicking this off with a story for us, and then we'll hear from everyone else. Nancy.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for having us all aboard. This is really important for our community. My deepest gratitude. June 12th, 5 years ago, wee hours of the morning, I get a phone call from a friend who's crying. I try to ascertain what's happened. All I'm hearing is bits and pieces, so I throw on the news, and something horrible has happened. They're quoting approximately, at that time, 25 people may be dead in a nightclub shooting. I did not realize at the time that it was Latin night. I'm a little older, so I don't tend to go out and play with everyone. But it became apparent to me when I left my home, went straight over to the LGBTQ center, because the news was constantly saying something happened at an LGBTQ club. And that was all the information we're getting. And if you look at headlines from that time, what you're going to hear or going to read is that this horrible massacre had happened that had taken place on the LGBTQ community. I went to the LGBTQ center, and people were crying in all kinds of emotional states. Trauma is trauma. It has an incredible effect on people. You freeze or you take action. That happens to the folks that were at the event as much as it happens to those who hear about it afterwards. Things were under control at the center. It was like organized chaos. So the next step was to go to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, the scenario changed for me. It felt no different than when a loved one had passed and my family would gather in one person's home and share coffee, share stories, cry together, and just pretty much spend the next couple of days just holding each other up until the funeral services were done with. And what I mean by that is I walked into the big waiting room, they had everybody in, and there were doctors speaking, everybody speaking in English. But around me, what I could hear was the Latin voices that I would normally hear at home had a tragedy happened. Everywhere I looked, everyone was Hispanic. Very few people were not. Next to me was a woman crying and holding on to the back of a chair. I thought she was going to fall over. So I said, Mama, siéntate, please sit down. And says, I can't because they read out some names and I didn't understand what they were saying exactly. And I think they read my son's name, but if it's not, if I go up and ask it if it's, and it's not, or it was, I don't know what I'll do. What had happened was that in arrogance, I call it arrogance, the people reading out the names and the people speaking to the folks in the room were doing everything in English. I walked up to a elected official who happened to be Puerto Rican, and I asked him, why are you not doing this in Spanish? And his reply was, well, not everyone speaks, Spanish. Some people speak English. So for the sake of the 2 or 3 people in the room, that's actually more than that, I admit. For their sakes, the entire overwhelming community that was in there had to endure the mispronunciation of their loved ones' names and then second guess whether or not it was their loved one. It was a rough time. It was a rough time. And in the days to come, it got even more complex. There were not enough Spanish-speaking social workers on staff at any of the city-supported agencies, whether it was caseworkers for mental health reasons or services. It was a struggle to get help in Spanish. And what struck me, and one of the reasons why my organization Del Ambiente, organization that is unapologetically Puerto Rican, LGBTQ Puerto Rican, one of the reasons why we exist was exactly what happened that night. It was painful. It was painful because we were a second thought. Nowhere did you see Hispanic anything going on. Everything was the LGBTQ community. It was kind of a little bit of a whitewashing at the time. And we get a lot of criticism and pushback on that, but that's reality. And I think, honestly, if we don't address that, if we don't bring it up, if we try to pussyfoot around it, it just continues. You have to call it out when you see it, right? So in the days to come, everybody was fumbling. And one of the things that comes up out of that is that the city was not a city that has so many Latinos, so many Puerto Ricans. Pulse was something that disproportionately impacted our community. And in the days to come, everything was fumbling. The city was not prepared for an emergency for anyone other than the English-speaking community. It was a rough trip and it was a rough time. And we're still fumbling through it. It is now 5 years later, we're preparing for the 5th anniversary. And it's still a rough ride for many of the survivors and for those moms and dads who have had to endure all this time. So I do want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. What I will tell you regarding Pulse, regarding the events of that day and anything else that this community has faced, it's that we are an incredibly resourceful and resilient community. And over the years, we've managed to stand up to a lot of adversity on 100 levels. But thanks to the many leaders that are correctly centered mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, we continue to move forward as a community, even if it's baby steps. And I'll take it. I'll take baby steps. I'm proud to share the space tonight with some of them. It's my pleasure to introduce you tonight to Dr. Wilfred Laviosa. He is an active community leader within marginalized communities for the past 25 years. He has made mental health, substance abuse, HIV/AIDS, and the focus of his advocacy. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, he possesses a doctorate in social work, and he is currently the CEO of Waves Ahead Corporation, a nonprofit company in Puerto Rico that focuses on the elder and LGBTQ plus community. Thank you, Wilfred, for being here. Lisbeth Melendez Rivera is a 35-year veteran of the LGBTQ and labor movements. We've seen her in the trenches working her magic. She is one tough cookie. Lisbeth has crossed the country helping to train future leaders of our communities. This is urgent. Many times we forget the importance of training our leaders to keep moving us forward. And Lisbeth has dedicated herself to doing just that. She's the former director of faith outreach training at HRC, where she worked with people of faith across different denominations to ensure a more inclusive environment for our community. Lisbeth is currently the organizing director at Jewish Voice for Peace, helping to amplify Jewish voices in support of a liberated Palestine. Last but not least, we have Reverend R.J. Robles. R.J. is a Puerto Rican queer and transgender community organizer, healer, and Christian minister. R.J. is one of the first transgender ministers in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. R.J. is currently a national council member to Disciples Alliance Q, an LGBTQ plus open and affirming ministry of the church, and is a healing coach for the National Queer and Trans Therapist of Color Network. Thank you all for being with us here tonight. As a community, we've come a long way. And I remember when I was young, when the marches started. It was the gay liberation movement that eventually became the colorful and happy pride parades that we see today. And certainly at that time, I did not imagine those colorful parades. All I knew was protest. You wore a band around your arm, you marched down the street. It was a big deal to go past St. Patrick's on Fifth Avenue. The cops would try to stop us. And the last thing that I could have possibly imagined was the day that would come that I'd be able to marry. But it's all been because of leaders like yourselves that identified the crucial issues to our overall physical, emotional, and spiritual needs, and have stood up to make things happen. We still have a long way to go. And that became evident the night of Pulse. And it became evident to this community, particularly after Hurricane Maria. So opening it up to everyone on the panel tonight, what are your thoughts about what it takes for our community to be able to sustain ourselves and live a life where we don't see what happened at Pulse happen again, where we don't fumble the ball when it comes to our LGBTQ Puerto Rican community who is blown here through the winds of a hurricane and has to suffer not only the usual madness that comes with being displaced, but also the discrimination that comes with it. What do you think, with all this adversity, what do you think it is that we need to do so that we can live a life with little to no regrets? Don't make me call on you.
Well, thank you so much for making this space. And usually we don't talk about these topics because they're taboo, even within our community. I would like to answer you, Nancy, from the perspective that I was living in Puerto Rico at the time. I had moved back home to Puerto Rico a few years before the hurricane in 2013, 2014, I moved back home to take care of my parents. And when I arrived, I saw that there was such a need for services for not just the LGBT community, for our elders. And the drought, then the government unrest, the economy, and then the hurricanes really brought that to the surface. We are a colony of the United States, and we need to call it that. We are a possession of the United States who can handle us and who can take care of us or not take care of us, however they see us fit. We saw that after the hurricanes with the president that is no longer in office, throwing at us paper towels so we could dry our land and so we could take care of our land like paper towels would do everything for us. Our community is very resilient, but is only resilient because of all of you, because of all the people in the diaspora and because of all the volunteers who have come to Puerto Rico to help us come back to some normalcy. We are very much diverse, as Andy mentioned it at the beginning. And if you're LGBT, you're a thought of, you're not thought of for the local government in Puerto Rico. And if you are LGBT elder, that's even worse because you're forgotten. But for those who are joining us today, we need to inform you all that Puerto Rico is getting older. It's supposed, the older community is supposed to reach over 55% by 2025. That's only a few years from now. We're going to be older rather than a young population. And so we need to continue our work. We need to continue our work on self-acceptance, on really be able to balance our mental health and our physical health and really help each other. Because that is one thing that Boricuas do have, is that we help each other. We have a sisterhood and a brotherhood that brings us together during bad times, during good times, and even during now these times of COVID, that we have seen the camaraderie that has brought to us together between those folks who live in the States and those folks who are here in Puerto Rico, and how we try to communicate and how we try to help each other. We know, and I know, that we are resilient, and I know that we will come out of this much stronger than before. And all of these traumatic experiences that we have had will make us much stronger. Maybe as individuals, maybe as a community, but maybe as a country. And so I'm hopeful that that will happen.
Anyone else?
RJ, would you like to say before I speak?
I am always here to learn alongside with my elders. So
Is that a nice way to call us old?
tú sabes, respeto, respect.
Age before beauty. You know, I've lived in this country for 37 years, and if people ask me all the time what home is, and I will always answer Puerto Rico. Doesn't matter that I've been in DC for 20 years. It doesn't matter that I lived in Boston for 20 something, you know, for close to 20 years. But what I will say is that a long time ago, I wrote a piece about who we are as a people, as an introduction to a report around Latinx same gender families. And, you know, there's something about ese tumbao, ese caminar, esa cosa que nosotros traemos, no? Like that movement, that way in which we carry ourselves, the ways in which we look at one another. Even under 10 feet of snow and with all the coverings in the world, I will spot a Puerto Rican coming 10 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are connected not just by heart, by blood, by land, by faith. And it is that desire to survive, because it's not resiliency, because I'm tired of that word, resiliency. Resiliency is like, you know, it feels like the Weebles. You hit you and you come back up again. We have an innate genetic memory to survive. 500 years of occupation, over 500 years of occupation. We are one of the oldest colonies in the world. And yet, even the most pro-statehood of people will have 3 beers and will be an independentista. I have seen the most hardened, like, people in the world look at an international event and see esa bandera, la monoestrella, like walk down a delegation and people will cry. We carry our artists, we carry our words. And the other thing that I was saying is that we are incredibly friendly. People think of us as angry and like, you know, like bruscos, and because we're loud and we move our arms a lot and, you know, but we talk to one another. We learn from one another, even if sometimes that takes a long time to do so. And I think that one thing that I share in common with all three of you is that desire who to constantly be in conversation about teaching and learning and reimagining what a free Puerto Rican looks like. Not Puerto Rico, a free Puerto Rican looks like. Because it's not just about our land, but it's about our own identities. Paul's was an event like no other. And I say that having been in Puerto Rico for Cerro Maravilla, having been in Puerto Rico for, you know, like I can tell you like moments in history in which we've all come together, but Paul's in particular. Just like you, Nancy, I was in the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning with people calling me. I am the director of faith at a national queer organization. And I'm also a spiritual pastor. And there were calls about who was there, what was happening, who had done the hurting, who had received the hurting. So I didn't have to deal just with the Puerto Rican community. I had to deal with my siblings in other faiths who were also being affected. And one thing that I kept coming back to is that it was that network of love that held us above the freight. It is that network of love that has always kind of stopped us from sinking, even at the worst of moments. I'll close by telling you that the January after Maria, we were in Washington, D.C., and there was a group of us talking, and Wilfred happened to have been there to, you know, I had asked Wilfred to come and join me to talk about Maria. And a bunch of us, a group of other people, other Puerto Ricans were there, and we were all working in national organizations here in the United States. And he said, we know that it is the queers that are going to be left behind. We know that it is the elders that are going to be left behind because they've gone back in the closet to live with family, to do. And so we walked to Wilfred and we said, we're going to recruit a bunch of people and we're going to go home and we're going to rebuild Puerto Rico from our people up, from the most forgotten up. And we've been doing that now for a long time. Why? Because it is that hammock, el vaivén de la hamaca, la tela, el tejido that stretches and shrinks, but always holds us up. So how do we stop pulse from happening again? Educating ourselves, sustaining ourselves, and simply being who we are. Because I wake up every morning with the desire that it will be the last day that I wake up to do this all over again.
Ashe, ashe. Wow, taking that in and also centering my own response. First of all, I want to say thank you again to Let's Reimagine Table Talk for this conversation and for inviting me into this conversation with you all today, and what has been like so many unravelings that we all continue to be in our individual and collective journey. I think what for folks who are joining, right, who may be thinking a lot about as well, like the status, the state, the history of Puerto Rico, And I say this, before I even share, right, like what I know. I'm not an expert beyond those that have taught me, beyond my own lived experiences. And so we are all four voices here, four experiences, four embodiments with our experiences throughout our lifetime. And so I'm really, as Lisbeth has shared, I think so much of what I love about us, particularly, is being able to learn with each other and unlearn together and continue to do the work in different ways, in healing ways and in liberating ways. And so let me just start by saying that I would not be here with you all today if it weren't for the struggles of liberation of my ancestors. Many who were arrested, held as political prisoners. And so there's some people I'd like to lift up that were important and crucial and still are to who I am, who I have become, and who I am still becoming. So as a queer and trans Boricua in diaspora, and joining you all tonight from the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Ottawa, known as Chicago. And so I'm gonna bring in some shy Rican fire, so bear with me. But I wanna lift up Julia de Burgos, Lolita Lebron, Sylvia Rivera, and especially a very dear ancestor, Soraya Santiago Soya. Because among these revolutionary women, mothers, abuelas, trans women, femme folks, tias, primas, and my abuelita still present with me today, which I will call by name, Victoria Perez Rodriguez and Barbara Santa Soto Lopez, which I am thankful to still have them in my life. Our people must be supported in our recovery and healing, and also empowered to redefine and prophetically imagine our futures. For too long, Puerto Rico, Borinquen, has suffered the political, social, economic consequences of colonization, capitalism, and white supremacy. All these things have to be named because they continue to penetrate, right? Penetrate and cause state-sanctioned forms of violence and hyper-surveillance of our peoples, both on the island and in the US diaspora. More people need to understand United States colonialism. And as Wilfred already mentioned, too, Puerto Rico is a 21st century colony of the United States, and still living in the diaspora, right? As a younger person, many of us have to learn and relearn this history because we're not taught this in schools, right? I have to seek this information out from my elders, from my community, both in diaspora and on the island. As somebody who grew up, my family's from Lares, Puerto Rico. So as you can see, the bandera back here for Grito de Lares, right? Part of the independence movement. And it's important, always been important to me to better understand that history and how that continues to show up today and impact our people today. And so when I say history, I'm thinking about the insular cases, what it says, what it means, and how this still applies and continues to impact our people. For those of you who are joining us and may not know, the insular cases authorized the colonial regime of the United States created by Congress, which then allowed the US to continue its administration and exploitation of Puerto Rico. They stated that we were, quote, alien races, and that we differed from our customs and modes of thought, ways of living, because we could not understand or follow these white principles, and therefore were, quote, unable to govern ourselves. And so what does this mean? To me, this means that we're still lacking in our constitutional rights, because as a colonial colony of the United States, there are ways that this continues to impact us. If I think of another example that still continues to impact, particularly my people from El Campo, my people from the mountainsides, the countryside, I'm thinking a lot about the Jones Act of 1920, right? And thinking here about how, for those of you who may not know, real briefly, this requires goods to be shipped between US ports to be transported on ships that are built, owned, and operated by US citizens, the US government. The Jones Act, what it did and continues to do is increases the cost of shipping of goods to Puerto Rico, right? As we rely on imports, and they restrict the number of vessels that can legally deliver goods. The Jones Act continues to damage Puerto Rico's economy. There's so much more. I'm just lifting up these two examples, right? I encourage people to read The War Against All Puerto Ricans, The Young Lords, A Radical History by Joana Fernandez, right? Because all of these things, the economy, the political, the social, it all connects, and the personal is political. The problems, right, with the infrastructure are rooted in a history of oppressive, racist, colonial, economic policies that are also cis-based and founded in cis heteropatriarchy, right? And so for me, what that looks like as a trans person, as a trans Boricua sibling, is that we need to also understand the connections between the US healthcare system, right? Things that happens, right? How my people were labeled when we first, came to the United States, and those first patterns of migration, later second patterns, right? When folks are getting diagnosed with something called the Puerto Rican syndrome, right? In the 1950s, that continued to psychopathologize our people, right? I'm talking about the history of forced sterilization of my Puerto Rican mothers and grandmothers, the murders of trans women of color in diaspora and in Puerto Rico, because those things are connected. I'm talking about conversion therapy of our LGBTQ Boricuas, and the role of Christian supremacy in all of that, in all of those foundations, and how this continues to tie back to oppression, control, exploitation, and eugenics, right? Where we deem some bodies as desirable in the eyes of the state. And so for me, these problems continue to be laid bare, especially in the last 5 years, through pulse shootings, through the hurricanes, through environmental racism, and now thinking, especially in the last 3 years, right, of organizing, again, on the island and in diaspora, to get the government to declare a state of emergency, right, that finally addresses or attempts to, because we can sit here all night and also talk about the inadequacies of it, but finally address, right, gender-based violence that is ongoing, right? Where we're talking in the last year and a half, 7 folks, right? 7 trans people who have been murdered and killed. And this is part of the ongoing state of emergency against gender-based violence. This is part of feminicides that continue to happen because of things like domestic violence. This is part of the culture, the cis heteropatriarchy that I'm talking about, because cis women and trans people are continuing to be killed and robbed of our futures and our present. And so for me, this movement, the Boricua movement, the queer Boricua movement specifically, the queer and trans Boricua movement specifically, this movement is not simply seeking to redistribute harms, but to abolish the systems that continue to harm us and hurt our people. And this is also where I see how faith and spirituality can support our movements and these processes and our collective journeys. But I'll stop there because I feel like that can open up the next part of the conversation about faith and spirituality.
That's actually where we're headed now. Is how does it help us? How does it help us to move forward? Because like I said at the beginning, I'll take the baby steps, because at the beginning it was baby steps. Now we're kind of expecting these leaps and bounds that are not perhaps the big leaps and bounds we wanted to see at this stage of the game, or we would like to see at this stage of the game, because we've gained ground, right? We've moved forward at an okay pace periodically, and so we must hunger for it. But how do we utilize our faith, or whether it's the organized religion? I know in my church, for example, um, giving food to the homeless is it. It's the name of the game. But stepping into the social justice realm, it kind of gets people getting all verklempt over it, kind of unnecessarily, or getting them to step out of their neighborhood into the neighborhoods that they perceive as more challenging. You know, what role do this organized religion or faith in general, and spirituality, all different, three different things, right? Almost all interrelated. How do we get that to help us?
In
Uh,
Puerto Rico, oh, Lisbeth, go ahead.
I wanted to make a little bit of a leap here and talk something to Nancy said in particular, around, you know, let's be real. Our movement have been leaping forward more so. We've achieved more in a shorter period of time than many others, and we can talk about how white supremacy has played some of that, you know, all kinds of other stuff around it. But to link it to faith, um, it's funny to me that people are willing to go to service once a week in search of salvation, um, but they cannot commit to a single social act a week for the sake of the salvation of our communities. There is a false equivalency around our faith that so many times gets spoken around, you know, oh, you know, I go to service every week, and yet you ask them to commit in the long term to something, they think that is a one-off. A one-off, and once that one-off is done, salvation has arrived. Give you an example. I am sure many people think that we have marriage locked in a box. Folk, you cannot be more wrong. If a law were to fix the problems we have, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that gave standing to people of African descent in this country in ways in which have not happened in the past, was all that we needed, we would be dealing with a very different question around racism. One that is historical in perspective and not present in nature. When we first passed, many, you know, Massachusetts always loves to talk about how they were the first of this and the first of that. And I remember, you know, passing bills around LGBTQ recognition in Massachusetts, and the people got them. And then they were like, we're here, we're queer. And they went to sleep. And when other governments came around and started taking rights away, people were like, well, you can't do that. It's like, why? They do it to people all the time. Like, a law only let's talk about something more relevant here. The Matthew Shepard, you know, in James Byrd Act, which talks about hate crimes around the LGBTQ community, you know, gives my wife the right to sue or to seek enhanced penalties should I, as a genderqueer individual, be hurt. It does nothing to stop them from hurting me. What stops them from hurting me is that constant conversation, that constant hammering around who we are. It is our daily church. It is our daily church to educate. Jesus did not stop on just to go to services on Shabbat. And for those who are asking what Shabbat is, that is the holy celebration in the Jewish religion, which Jesus happened to be one. Jesus worked throughout. And those linkages, you know, how does it help us move forward? Is that constant shoring up of each other in community, that, you know, that community that you achieve for many Christians when they sit all together under a building in their pews, or you are in a ritual in, you know, in a Santera, you know, religion, you know, like proceeding, or, you know, or you are in a sense in a spiritismo, or you're, you know, however it is that you achieve that sense of togetherness. How do you carry that sense of togetherness outside of that space? Because it is that kind of cohesiveness that helps us lurch forward and sustain the growth. Otherwise, we are getting to the top of the ladder and the rungs underneath us are falling apart. And the myth that all LGBTQ people are faithless and that all faith people are not queer, it is just that, but a myth. And it is one of the first ones that we have to achieve when, in the name of scripture, scripture is used as a tool of hate and not the instrument of love that it was created to be. That kind of concept helps us move forward. Otherwise, we're stuck like a hamster in a damn wheel, doing the same things over and over again. And mind you, I want the training wheels off. I want to keep moving. As a woman, as a gender queer, cis woman, as, you know, so what if I don't fit your definition of femininity? See if I care. However, it matters to many other people, and therefore it is my duty to bring us to community, to bring us to church, and to preach the gospel of equality, the gospel of justice. Because equality is an overused word. The gospel of justice, of equity. We might get someplace, somewhere at that point. Sorry, Wilfred, I interrupted you.
No, it's genuinely important that we understand that verbiage is the shifting and the evolution of verbiage. That moves us forward also within these spaces, and we have to be conscious of it. So in the way you referred in the verbiage and you reframe things is important, because the message does get stale after a while. And it's like leaving the little note by the door. That'll remind me every day to put the keys in the same space, and just the note just becomes a little piece of paper on the wall. We walk by it 100 times a day. Same thing. But Wilfred and Manu.
No, I want to continue on the same line that both of you are saying, because in Puerto Rico, we need to continue reading and reimagining really future. We need to continue trying to make something out of where we are at. What I was going to mention is that the fundamentalists here, the religious fundamentalists, are really here in Puerto Rico taking ground, because the things that we have been able to accomplish internally as a whole, but they have gained ground. And I know the policies and the legislation that we have been to act in the last month have really gotten a lot of contestation, a lot of anger groups. They have 2 legislators that were voted in the last election, and they have gained a lot of ground. So we, as a community, as an LGBT community, in all of our intersectionalities, just have to take one day at a time, one struggle at a time. They have mentioned my brothers and sisters, transgenders, who have been and who continue to be killed, and there's no one who did the crime, no those crime except one, because she was murdered inside the jail, a male jail to be exact, being female, and so it was in jail. So of course, the person who killed her was captured. But all the rest have gone unsolved. The government here hasn't wanted to solve them, for that matter. And we need to call them, we need to continue calling them, and we need to continue reminding ourselves that these are brothers and sisters of our community. If we are so proud doing the LGBT, well, it's LGBT. It's not just the G or the L's or the B, the T. It's a community. And we're Boricuas. So that's even more complex because of all our different backgrounds, all our different religious beliefs, you know, and we need to respect that. You know, a quick anecdote, we're trying to remind us of all of these brothers and sisters transgender who have been murdered, and we trying to erect a monument in the town, in the place where Alexa was murdered, which was, she was homeless. She had some mental health issues that were not being addressed, and she was murdered in her home, which is a tent in side of the road. And we're trying to erect it. And right now we have had, and soon I will share, and maybe Andy can share it, an email of a person who can have just a signature and approve that in the central government. And they don't want to be reminded that our brothers and sisters are being killed every day. They don't want to be reminded, so they don't want the monument. The monument that was erected here for the Pulse victims was because it was San Juan, and the mayor was very pro LGBT issues. I need to call her name, Carmen Julín Cruz, and she was one of the biggest advocates of the LGBT community here in Puerto Rico. And that's why we have a monument to remind us of the hate crimes that occurred in Pulse. Otherwise, that would not have happened either. So we need to fight, and you, the diaspora people, our allies, need to unite to help us here in the mainland, in Puerto Rico. This is our mainland.
That's right.
This is your home. This is my home. You need to help us. And that's why I know Lisbeth mentioned that January moment, and I always continue saying it. Thank you for not forgetting us. I even said that to Andy when he developed this topic, forgetting us. Because islands sometimes think that we are forgotten because we are just some miles away from the US and we're forgotten. But thank you so much for not forgetting us. And we need to continue the struggle so we don't forget our brothers and sisters who are being killed of the LGBTQ community, just one segment of the community.
What I'm really clear on is that we need each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the more centered you are, the whole body, mind, and spirit thing, the more clear you are on what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. And the better conversation you can have with the youth that's going to continue to sustain this. I think of the four of us, I'm the one that's retired. I'm the one that's can kick back and put her feet up and watch you all and go, you know, at appropriate moments. But I'm speaking sincerely.
And yet you don't do that, Nancy. I know for a fact that is not what you do.
Mujer. I felt that bus run me over just now. And it's because I don't know how. And I think when you carry it in your heart and when you feel it from a higher power, from a bigger place, you can't stop. You can't stop. You might maybe withdraw a little bit because by staying in the picture, I don't let a young person in. You can mentor from outside the circle. Otherwise, the leader does not develop. Mm-hmm. It just keeps getting thrown in your lap. But I think that it's really important for us to understand the role that we play in pushing this and moving it forward. Even if it is an inch, it's an inch gained, not lost. So you guys are like, you're my heroes because you're still in the fray. As I was telling Andy earlier, he was commenting, oh, I have a LGBTQ Puerto Rican flag in the background, and he saw all this other stuff. There's a cross over my head somewhere. And the one I don't get to show very often because it's not the popular topic right now. So that's going on the wall eventually, as soon as I get a nail strong enough. But it's all that we are. We are all these pieces. We are exposure to all these different things. And it's what keeps us moving forward. The knowledge that you gain from each one of these components that make up your lives is what gives you the white hair. I'm convinced it's what helps you to keep the open mind and to understand those that are maybe not really that user friendly, maybe not that kind to us. We don't always have to, I mean, every now and then you have to take a swing at them, I confess. But that doesn't always have to be the first response. Sometimes we need to take the time to understand them so we develop a better plan to deal with them. I just got a 2-minute warning. No, 10-minute warning. Sorry about that. Scared myself. What would you each like to say as we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in here real quick. You know, I've really been appreciating all of what we've been bringing, right, to the sacred space. And so I love stories and want to continue to bring in a story too of that's my story, right? So on this talk about spirituality and faith and its role to help, right, our collective healing and liberation as LGBTQIA children and siblings, as queer and trans, as femme folks, as two-spirited beings, as children of Madre Tierra, Mother Earth, right? However you relate, however you identify, whatever connects you. I grew up around many evangelical, Jibaro Catholics, spiritual folks on the island and in the diaspora, practicing in churches, in our homes, in our community. I wouldn't trade what I've been through because it has made me who I am and what I am today and who I continue to become. And around 14 years old, I remember I got more into church, more into praying, more into worshiping. And I'm going somewhere with this, right? And as I was wrestling with my sexuality and gender identities as a young Rican diaspora queer baby, I remember wrestling with the divine and with God quietly, even though I'm younger, quietly. Because I had been raised to believe, right, that homosexuality is sinful and not natural. And that was a belief that continued, that was passed down in my younger generation. And I did not know then what I know now, that this type of messaging, this so-called belief is actually death dealing, because that's what it is. You gotta call it like it is, like what it is, right? And there is a gospel of liberation, a gospel of justice, like Lisbeth mentioned, one that actually understands and preaches queerness and transness as deeply divine and sacred. And so I think that, you know, there's so much that I can bring to this table talk to talk about spirituality and its roles, right? Spiritualities, right? Understanding our Afro-Indigenous traditions as well that hold us and sustain us. And I think these times, right? We need to trace back the path that we have taken since birth, let go of paths that were actually laid down to us by others, daring to leave paths that no longer serve us, making decisions to center our pleasures, our rest, our healing, our souls, relearning how to listen to our intuitions, slowing down, speaking kindly to ourselves, embracing our inner child, working with elements to get reconnected to Mother Earth, to create a relationship that is based in the respect of plants, in the understanding that water is life, that we each have a place to contribute in meaningful ways to sharing knowledge, resources, supporting and uplifting each other. And that, you know, I want to say something that a lot of our families don't realize, that they may have actually caused emotional damage in the first place. I know my parents were definitely wrapped up in what they were going through at the time, surviving, not necessarily considering the impact that that may have had on me as a young child, right? And I've had to come to terms with a lot of things and the fact that I may never get to hear an apology. And I think taking responsibility for harm done to children can be very painful and difficult because it brings up a lot. I like to stir the pot, so I'm stirring the pot a little bit right now. But I really want to take this opportunity to speak to young people joining us now or later, to know that the shame is not ours to hold on to or carry. It's not. There's nothing wrong with you. Have compassion for yourself. Be gentle, deeply caring. Mother yourself and your inner child always. It's not too late to do so, whatever age. Release the resentments and the anger. Be accountable to your own healing. Know that there are resources for healing ancestral, historical, and generational traumas. And we are all called to do the work of breaking the cycles, whatever cycles we grew up in, whatever cycles we were in the thick of, in the midst of. Why? Because we want un Puerto Rico libre, and that requires each and every single one of us seeing the connections and what is happening internally at a cellular level, what is happening locally on the island and in diaspora, globally, regionally, and locally. Always being with those who are resisting, not with those that are oppressing and further colonizing us. And so for me, I like to ask myself a lot of questions. I journal a lot. That's one of my spiritual and healing practices. And so I raised some questions, knowing that we don't have the answers and so much to talk about in this plática, and this table talk. But I think of questions like, what experiences have been vital to your unlearning and growth? What do you love about our people? What are your own healing and spiritual practices? How are you reclaiming, remembering? And how can you extend, right, your own magic, your co-creative magic to our communities, familias, and people?
Before we end, does anyone out there want to chime in?
And while people are putting their questions, I want to give you 3 sentences for me that are really important. The first one is, no matter what day it is, I am a Boricua Butch Dyke. I am a Catholic Boricua Butch Dyke. As a young woman, I held the dying hands of my siblings in the 1980s and 90s when their families forgot about them in the hospitals of Boston and New York. Travel 95 north and south with bodies in the back of my car to give them proper burial because their family forgot them on the streets, in the dumpsters, and the morgues. Never, even though I was not a practicing Catholic at the time, have I ever doubted my faith, because it is what carried me through. And I cannot tell you the amount of buildings, particularly churches, I stopped at in my journeys to look at the walls and to center, to take care of myself so that I could take care of others. That idea that RJ brought forth around taking care of ourselves, of resting, of shedding the shame, is so important. Dying with our faith intact is an act of survival, because faith has been used to hurt us and to try to erase us. That could be further from the truth. 6 verses versus 35,000. 6 versus 35,000. We exist, we've always existed, and we've always been faithful. Faith has been used to hurt many, but it's uplifted me in my journey, and it's given me the reason, as the daughter of Santeras, Espiritistas, and Católicos, That will always be true. And so please understand, I am a Boricua, Butch, Catholic tyke, and I will be so till my faith carries me, wherever it is that faith carries you after this body expires.
I think it's very important that we all understand faith is your relationship to God. It's not the building. It's not what that one said, what the other one said. It's your relationship to the spirit. So I see, Andy, if you would let us know, is there enough time for, there's a question here?
Yes, absolutely. Take questions.
Awesome. Awesome.
And Wilfred
You
wanted.
wanna-
Before we take the
No,
question,
I caught
One-
Wilfred.
what I wanted to mention is that services and units of organizations here in Puerto Rico don't tend to work through all of these issues together. They separate us. And one of the things that I am very proud of Waves Ahead here is that we try to bring spirituality, our faith, with our mental health and also our body health. We not only honor our spirituality by incorporating different types of techniques of therapy that bring the inner child, like dirt therapy and mental health therapy and counseling, but also we try to work through the spirituality. We just finished constructing a room for meditation because we understand the importance of taking time from our day, our staff, our clients, our participants, to go in there into that room, close yourself and be able to experience and to refocus. Some people call it mindfulness, other people call it a moment of meditation, whatever you want to call it. We want to honor all of us, all of who you are, and providing you a space that we can come together and by yourself or with some other one and be able to explore and recenter before we go outside to do the struggles every day. So very proud of that. And many organizations forget that we have all components in us and that we need to honor our spirituality, our faith, and our body. So.
Carlos, I see you have a question. Would you like to ask it out loud?
Hey, beautiful people. Thank you so much. I'm Carlos from the Bronx, NYC.
I love the Bronx.
I'm super inspired by this conversation. I do political organizing work myself. I organize in particular men of color, gender nonconforming men assigned male at birth to redefine themselves and understand violence domestication. My question is, what tools or knowledge do we need to learn as Boriqueños to raise the consciousness of the people in our environments, of the people in our family members, of even ourselves? What tools or knowledge do we need to learn or gain to expand upon our people?
I'll give you my 3 top ones, and then I think Wilfred and RJ can add. Conflict resolution. Like we cannot, what I learned from my parents was that you never fight angry, because when you fight angry, you don't hear each other. So conflict resolution is much more than just resolving a conflict. It is how you enter into that conversation. Anger management. Keep your anger to yourself, not to the conversation, because again, fighting angry is not going to get you anywhere. And love for oneself. Enter that conversation knowing that nothing that is said there is about you, but about the fear the person in front of you has of the power held by you.
I think RJ mentioned something very important, which is our history and our ancestors. We need to learn about our past. I will ditto what Lisbeth also mentioned, but just our history and our struggles of our history. Books that are recently being constructed written about our past are so important, and we need to honor our community. There are so many LGBT Boricuas who have done so much for us, and we don't honor them, and we need to continue honoring. So visit wavesahead.org because we are trying to honor them. We're trying to honor them as heroes and heroines of our community, and so they're so important to our future. Soraya was mentioned, RJ mentioned Soraya. Soraya was one of our first people who moved Waves Ahead, who didn't think I was this person like going out of his mind doing this type of work here. And she really was supportive of that. Well, Lisbeth is another one. But we need to honor them and learn about your history.
I would also quickly add to the conversation, you know, there's you know, somebody that has been stereotyped or called the angry trans person in the room from time to time. You know, one of the things that really helped me when it comes to that conversation about understanding rage, understanding, you know, how I can move with it, right? How not to let it stagnate, how not to let that energy, that force field, right? How to actually explore it, dive into it, right? Fully embody it in order to heal from it, and work through it. And so I'm thinking a lot about a recent book that just came out last year in the years of work, by Lama Rod Owens, Love and Rage, The Path of Liberation Through Anger. So you just reminded me of his badass, dope ass work. A fellow Black liberationist, healer, practitioner as well. There's so many folks. You know, I would also look into understanding, unpacking, right, seeing the connections between some of what we've been kind of talking about here tonight, especially with your role. As you said, you work with young people and young men specifically, and also like, you know, having the conversations around toxic masculinity, how not to pass that down, right? How to break outside of that, talking a lot about, you know, helping each other out and supporting each other through that. And also makes me think about a lot about knowing, you know, the histories and the practices of healing justice as well, that also anchor us, that also give us that the tools, right? As you were asking about, to be able to show up in movement and in the work differently, so that we can come from a place that is grounded and rooted and more conscious of our bodies and of each other as we build together, for movement, for a better world, for a better you know, life of actual, you know, of liberation and of freedom and of justice.
Charles, you had something to say, sweetie?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for all of this. I mean, it's a lot to that lands on me with everything everyone has been sharing tonight. But I think one of the things that I put in the chat was the question of that. I think there was something very specific about the Puerto Rican experience of being Puerto Rican that we were talking about, you know, particularly when we were talking about like the two, I guess in recent histories is more tragedies, but like when we're talking about Pulse and we were talking about the Hurricane Maria, right? And so from that specific place of our culture and the experiences that were directly kind of affecting the Puerto Rican community, to this discussion of spirituality and finding the space inside of spirituality for so many things that we talked about. I was wondering if there was something, how do we see the connection or the reason of holding them both together? Like what's urgent or essential about holding our Puerto Ricanness and our spirituality together?
That's a conversation for a whole like other seminar, webinar, because it's a longer question. And before I you know, I don't want to let it go, Charles, but you know, as a member of the BAD family, I'm always in awe of all the work you do. So, which I also happen to think is part of our spiritual healing, because there's so much healing in the arts, right? So you talk about essential and urgent, and those are the places where we find outlets for that anger, for that hurt. When I started traveling to Puerto Rico to do spiritual work, there was one opening and affirming church in the entire island. One. There are now over 10. The open, that space where people and their families can go to heal and to talk about this pain that these events have had. And how do we interact showing up into these spaces from the perspective of faith? Because people don't expect us to show up. I mean, Wilfred mentioned, Waves Ahead, and in Reconstruye Q, which is the project that we use to rebuild queer housing and other spaces in Puerto Rico. And not once have we not shown up with that faith perspective to say, we get it. And we know the role that formalized therapy works in a place where the incidence of suicide is off the charts. We didn't even talk about that. It's like off the charts. And I'll let Wilfred talk more about that if he feels inclined to do so. But spiritual care, when you think that God doesn't love you, and therefore, because the fundamentalist movement in Puerto Rico is constantly telling you that these disasters are your fault because you're queer or you're female in body or you don't get married to please, like whatever. But at the end of the day, it's about you are a bad Christian. For us to show up with this perspective of a loving God means that and that urgency that God loves you, no matter what man says. And I'm very clear with the fact that I say men, though in Puerto Rico, women are in the running for the top prize. I'll be clear, because the wonders of the world need to go. However, and most part men, that urgency to heal the spirit is part of our survival. We've done it with our our African ancestors did it through Santeria. Our Taino ancestors did it through Espiritismo and natural, in a relationship with nature that is unparalleled. Anytime you go eat that barbecue, please remember that it was the Arawaks who invented barbecue. And our pits in the sand. But that all that ritual, all of those things, there's an urgency to it that helps us feel from the spirit. And we cannot forget that it is, when you talk to somebody and at the end of the day, the question is, but does God still love me? You know that there's an urgency there that is unparalleled. So being Puerto Rico, Dominicano, Cubano, Latina, as queer people, we speak from our own experience in Puerto Rico has been so important, but the reality is, it is not just urgent, but essential. Not just essential, but necessary.
Mhm. I'll add some, that was so juicy. Thank you, Lisbeth. I'll add real quick to honor our time and your question, which I really appreciate. You reminded me of something that Taina Abuela said, that it's not just, that for me hold well in tangent and in relationship to what you're saying, what you were asking about, that it's not just say, no solo decir, soy boricua, para que tú lo sepas, right? It's not just say, I'm Puerto Rican, just so you know, because I'm loud and I'm Puerto Rican, la, la. No, it's not just about that. It's about ser boricua de todo corazón, right? It's about being boricua in all of our hearts, in the root, in the center of our hearts, of our beings, because that's the heartbeat. That's what truth comes from in here, right? That connects me to the beat of the drum. That allows me to slow down. That reminds me, right, to live life, right? As much as capitalism will have us die, right? And live this fast-paced life, right? Like it reminds me to slow down and go back to the ways, right? To reclaim, right? To help me live life in more sustainable ways and in spiritual ways and in ways that are meaningful and purposeful and an intent. So that's what you reminded me of, and that for me is how I keep, the togetherness and see, that's just who we are. That's just who I am. Thank you for your question. I appreciate it.
Folks, it's 9:25. I think we have to wrap up. I'm going to be sharing a poll now, but while I'm doing that, I just want to thank our wonderful speakers, Reverend R.J. Robles, Nancy Rosado, Wilfred Labiosa, Lisbeth Melendez Rivera. Nancy, you started, our conversations before about telling me how, handsome I am, how, guapo, you've used that word for Wilfred also, that I used it for Lisbeth as well. You are all beautiful, physically, spiritually. Again, you're all my teachers. I'm just so grateful that you opened up this space for us. I'm gonna launch this poll now. It's a bit of a long one, but I'd really appreciate, folks, if you would take the time to fill this out. It's about 7 questions. It helps us a lot at Reimagine to assess what we're doing, to raise money. It's all really important. So if you guys could do that, I'd appreciate it. And while I'm doing that, I do want to let everyone know that you can find previous recordings and upcoming events for Table Talk at letsreimagine.org/tabletalk. And feel free, to contact me at andy@letsreimagine.org to let me know, if you want to get involved, if you want to host your own event as part of Reimagine, you can do that. And I would just love to hear from you. I think that's it. Do we have any final words from some of our speakers?
We're a quiet bunch, Andy.
I don't believe it.
We're talked out, dude.
All right. With that said, muchas gracias. Thank you all. And I look forward to seeing you at next week's Table Talk. It's same evening, Tuesday, June 8th. We're going to hear from the House Ballroom community. Please join us. And I hope to see you then. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, Andy.
Night.